Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good late night, wherever you are. And first, we're going to start with a little bit of background for our talk around imagining experience edge for XM. Just to start with who we are, Sebastian, you might
I can start out presenting myself. Yeah, so I'm Sebastian Winslow. I'm working as CTO at Valtech Denmark. I have been working with the Sitecore platform since 2004, version 3 and upwards, and done loads and loads of different implementations. Having fun with that on all parts.
And I'm Stephen Singh. I'm a Group Senior Vice President of Technology at Valtech, leading our Sitecore practice globally. I worked with Sitecore since 2001, I think, and been doing all kinds of stuff, including tons of ISV modules back in the old days and so on. Also, been on some roller coaster rides with all the new versions that have come. But both of us are really, we've worked for a long time with Sitecore, and for this presentation, a lot of what we're talking about has also been inspired and helped by Per Bering, our good old friend. I think if we kind of get into the actual topic of our talk is, well, there was the Sitecore hackathon some months back, and when we saw there was the opportunity to enter with headless options, we thought kind of two things. First of all, once before we had tried to ourselves build like a headless implementation for Sitecore. It was like a publishing engine that would put content into protobuf, and then we had a .NET Core runtime that would be able to serve that content. And combined with the information we heard that Sitecore would be releasing Experience Edge for XM, we were kind of curious how would that be done and how would that work. So anyway, we came up with the idea to do the project called Sitecore Poor Experience Edge for .NET, which is abbreviated Speedo. You can see the link to the repository from the hackathon below, and we're going to show you a little bit about in this talk what we did and how that compares to what Sitecore actually doing with Experience Edge for XM, and the shortcomings of well, I would say what we've done. Of course, there are tons of shortcomings, but also some of the maybe ideas where an approach like what we've done would make sense. So if we start by looking at an overview of how excuse me, how Sitecore's hybrid headless works compared to what we wanted to do is that, in a normal setup, you have a Sitecore CM, which is serving or running on the master database. You publish it to the CD, and then you have the rendering host, which is doing layout service requests back to the CD all the time when it needs to render a page. What we were thinking was, okay, maybe we can do something where we persist the content instead of relying on the CD. We persist it into a blob. In this case, currently in what we are going to show you, it's using a file system, but you could be persisting this into Azure blobs, S3, whatever you wanted to do that with. And then the rendering host is simply just serving static assets. So a little bit like doing static site generation, but you still have the dynamic abilities of a .NET Core rendering host, but it's only that it's CD-less and it doesn't have that latency or need for intensive CPU workloads to generate the layout service response. So I think it's kind of simple. It scrapes the layout service and persists it and allows the rendering host to read it statically. And now Sebastian will do a demo of what we actually did.
Yeah, so let me just briefly take the presentation away. I hope that the site is up. Can you confirm that, Stephen, that I'm showing the right thing?
You are.
Perfect. So, as Stephen mentioned, we were building this engine to get the static content published from Sitecore, and around it we built this this sample site to be able to actually demonstrate what was going on, and that's just a completely ordinary site with a couple of pages to it. There are some different banner components and stuff like that with content, and all of that, of course, looks perfectly normal, should do. Inside of Sitecore, it's structured in a couple of pages, and then we have some banner components below, and I can change content. Let's just do it here. Put test on it. I can publish it, and everything seems to be quite normal. Out here we should see that the change has come and all good, but this could of course just be me sitting and showing you what happened from the web database. So let me take the Explorer view. As Stephen told, we have the file server to actually store the content and retrieve the content from. It's running in containers, and you can see the path up here. We have decided to publish our content into a structure. Let me start here. Yeah, under Speedo with the page content and the media content in two different folders. And if I go into the media, there will be a structure resembling whatever is in the media library with the images down here. And if I go into content, then there will be a structure that folder by folder resembles the pages that are being published. And in each folder, if there is an actual version of the item, there will also be a language named version in JSON, JSON file containing the actual content in here. So let's take the front page, which we were looking at. Let's try to see if we can find. Here we had the dad jokes test. Content that I just created. And now this, of course, could also be just smoke and mirrors that I had already prepared in advance. So let's go back to Sitecore and see the same flow. Let me remove it back to the original content, save it, publish it, and then first look at the site. Everything has disappeared, and going to the file again, I can see that an external program has modified it. That is perfectly okay. I reload, and now the value is back to that joke. So showing that it is the same content that we are looking at all the way through. I could also, from within the files, of course, change it directly, and it will reflect out here as well. Not the idea to do it like that, of course. Also, to show how we publish, I could basically remove, let me take the content and media files and delete everything. Go back out to the site. Now it should tell me that nothing is found because I have no longer no content. If I go back in here and I make a publish, well, let me do just here. and then go back to my folder structure, and it's recreated with all the items here. The same will happen if I'm going to system, going to languages, adding another language, doesn't really matter which one. And let me go up to just homepage here. There is no version. If I publish now, I'm expecting to still see no version here, and that is because it's 0, but as soon as I add a new version and publish it again, if I go back, then hopefully something else was come up, and there it is, the file that represents the next language. So yeah, this is demonstrating the correlation between the publishing and the placement in the file server and retrieval from there as well. Also, as part of it, we have included, let me see, I have opened it here. Yeah, that's fine. Logging of what is going on, and I have just cut it out so it's a little bit easier to see. The lines removed a bit of it, but here you can see that we start the publishing handler for Speedo, and when it starts, actually the first thing we write we are doing, but we are not currently, so this is one of the shortcomings, but that is to check if we could abort, and the idea is here to say if nothing has changed, then don't publish anything, because that would be just a waste of time. Then we save a snapshot, and the snapshot that we are saving is then line by line displayed, which requests are being made for the content, and for the media we are looking whether or not we have to put it out. If the file exists, of course we don't put it out once more, and then telling whenever the snapshot is finished and how long time it has taken. So that's pretty much around Speedo in terms of how it's working from the user perspective. And I think I will throw it back to you, Stephen, and you can tell how this setup aligns with Experience Edge. And I need to flip this again. Sorry.
I certainly can. So yeah, now Sebastian demonstrated how Speedo worked, and now I'll just explain a little bit about Experience Edge. So Experience Edge is Sitecore's new delivery platform. It's a SaaS offering that will, as it shows here, sit in between your CM and the client browser. Again, Experience Edge in context of Sitecore XM renders the CD void. We don't need it anymore. And the way that it's working is that on the CM, you install an Experience Edge connector. And that Experience Edge connector will publish content to the Experience Edge SaaS. It publishes items, and it publishes for items that have layout. It publishes a layout snapshot as a JSON blob, and then it publishes media as well. Then from your applications, the way you build them, either some things you can, of course, retrieve directly out in the client browser. You can get the item and layout data through the GraphQL endpoints and just requesting media. But you, of course, can also use this with whatever technology you're using in between. For example, in the center, you see runtime server rendering, which could be the rendering host, for example, which then consumes item and layout data, generates HTML, and serves it to the client browser. And the same would go for build time static rendering solutions as well, doing the same. So all of this then works in the sense that it's giving you it renders CD void. It also gives you edge delivery, so it can scale it at edge, and both serving the item layout data, item and layout data, because layout data is embedded into items in principle. You can set caching rules. You can cache the responses at edge for a certain period of time. And for media, basically those are also served through CDN, and it will be white labeled, so you can do CNAMEs to that endpoint that you have. And to make it work ideally with the setup that Sitecore have, they have translation rules that would take the normal scaling query strings and transform them into the media parameters of the CDN. So basically, they can offer a complete solution where you put in the publishing connector, and you start building using a different origin, being the experience edge instead of your CD, and you are basically independent of the CD. I think that is the short description of how this works. So if we look a little bit about shortcomings, because and now we're talking more about shortcomings of Speedo, what we did, because Experience Edge has not been done in 24 hours, but for hackathon we had 24 hours, and that sets a lot of limitations. As I mentioned, conceptually, we had an idea because we had been working on similar ideas before. So we conceptually had like what we might want to try and achieve, but there are still many things that are not ideal. However, I want to stress a couple of shortcomings that are a bit or quite large. And the first one actually goes for both, and I want to make sure that everyone is aware of that it goes for both Experience Edge and for the Speedo thing, is that it is called Experience Edge for XM, and Speedo is also for XM. And that is, of course, because we are caching the layouts as JSON, and that means that there is no personalization possible. It is a single result, so it is for XM, literally speaking. But I would say, if you then look beyond that, the really big, could you with Speedo do the same kind of thing as we've done for media? Yes, you could. But one very big difference is that we literally only have in Speedo the layout. We have no item representation, and that means that a really big difference between Experience Edge and Speedo is the support for GraphQL. And we'll touch more on that topic later, why that is actually an important thing to support. But maybe, Sebastian, now you can explain a little bit more about challenges around publishing.
Yeah, sure. And that will be first and foremost, again, with an outset in how Speedo is working and what we have done. And we will also see a little bit on the code, which is, of course, interesting on a presentation like this, on how it's actually working. So the publisher that is in Speedo is basically these two processors that are going into, first of all, as I said, see if we could skip publishing at all, and then the save of the snapshot. and that is triggered when the normal Sitecore publish operation is completed. When saving the snapshot, we are, as Stephen also mentioned, scraping the local host, or could be whichever other endpoint that we would like. And this is not the ideal solution. We would have liked to do this through the layout API responses, but in the 24 hours we had, we didn't manage to actually make that work. Though I think we came quite away with it, but we needed something working within that constraint. So this is why we ended up doing it like this. When the publisher itself starts, we are looking at sources that are defined. A source being, as you can see here, defined in configuration files, specifying which part of the media library we want to include, and also which site in our site configuration that we want to include. So there is a mapping through the site name for that. Also, we are specifying where we want the files to be located. When doing this, we are basically looping through all items where there is a layout defined on a, in this case, a hard-coded device, which is the default device. And if there is, sorry, if there is a configuration of the presentation, then we will loop all languages, and if there is a version, then we will create the file. This also means that whatever settings you are putting in the publishing dialog within Sitecore, they are basically ignored because the logic resides within here. There are some things that, of course, here would improve how this is working, and we've tried to list them out here. The URL builder options, you can see here in this part that they are also hard-coded. That could have been configurable. So you could have determined whether or not you wanted to have different settings than this. The same goes for the publishing options. As I mentioned, they are basically ignored. The devices we have implemented with one of them. You could pull in a full site configuration if you wanted to, but we have that through the first line where we are getting the site as specified in the config files. And then there is the issue with scraping the local host, which would have been nicer to do through the API. But as you can see, it's pretty simple what is actually going on. And then, of course, we are saving the items with a definition saying that we want a folder structure. So if there is an item with versions needs to be created, then please create a folder with a corresponding name, and then these JSON files within. There are challenges when doing the publishing operation, and there could be different ways of approaching this. We have chosen to work with snapshots, and in this case, we are working with only a single snapshot, which of course provides some problems because basically we are throwing or publishing out everything, and of course the bigger your site becomes, the more you need to publish. We are not taking into consideration if things have already been published, but just overwrite whatever is there. But even worse, on the downside, you can say, we are not cleaning up after ourselves, meaning that items that were in reality deleted, they are not being removed. One way to go around this could be to introduce the concept of head files and creating more than just one snapshot, and then you would also support the possibility to roll back in time on the site or view the site in whichever of the available snapshots that you would want. Another approach is, of course, to try and go in and figure out what are you actually going to delete, and what is needs to be left just alone, and what is to be updated. But there are, of course, some complexity around that. So some of these things we are also mentioning, as Stephen will also illuminate later on, in terms of what can you use this for, but also to warn against what you cannot use it for. And with some of these things that we have shown here, it's definitely not intended to go straight in to production. Stephen also talked a little bit about the support for GraphQL, and the reason why that is a super cool thing to have introduced in the Experience Edge, and would also be sweet to have in Speedo, is that you could then choose to identify parts of your solution that are, let's say, more globally shared across your sites, and not include those parts for the static rendering. And the reason to do that is, of course, to avoid constant cache invalidation on everything when you change just minor things. And looking at this page, you could then split it up and say you have the actual page content, which could come from the published layout, the static content. And then you could have things like the global navigation, breadcrumbs, stuff like that, which you could retrieve through GraphQL queries on the items that would be published as well. So it's still not going back to the CM or anything to retrieve things. It's just looking at in respectively the published layout JSON responses and the item parts. So that is definitely a super cool thing. Then there is a little bit about how this works, runtime, how is it configured, how much is actually needed in order to get this running, and even though it's doing quite a lot, it's surprisingly a surprisingly small amount of code, I think, personally, that needs to be done in order to get all of these things running. If you will take this one, Stephen.
Yeah. So, and this comes to our, I would say, the main part of our curiosity. How would Experience Edge actually work for XM? How much would you have to change? So we started looking a bit into changing the configuration in a rendering host setup, and see how we could serve content in a different way than doing actual layout service requests. And what you see here is that in startup, we basically we just basically replaced the handler. Instead of, I think it's called layout service handler by default, and we replace it with a Speedo handler. And that Speedo handler is then configured with information about where to pick up the files in the file system, as you saw before. In our case, it mounts it as volumes in Docker, but so these paths suggest, but this could be configuration for different kinds of providers. And then basically in that handler that we have, there is on the next page the actual layout handler. You can change the slide, Sebastian. Oh, you have, maybe I'm looking at my own screen. In the actual layout handler, it's basically just looking up based on the request that's coming in, based on the route, the language, and the item path, and picking up the file from the file system. It's really that simple. There were a few small things that we had to change, and that was in the controller. We needed to change some small things because we didn't get HTTP status back from a file, of course, from loading a file. But it was really quite small things that had to be done. So I think this actually proved to us that it's quite simple to replace, and there are many things that you could imagine that you could both, just like we're used to with pipelines in Sitecore XP, that we can extend a lot of things, and the same goes for the rendering host. It's quite extensible. You can pretty much hook into the process as you want. Regarding, did you want to say something, Sebastian?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that this part of the implementation from Sitecore side on this part is extremely well structured and easy to find around. So yeah, this is what also led to the easiness of it, I think.
Yeah.
We'll go to this one for you.
Yeah, and then for media, we chose a bit of the fast way to achieve it. So of course, first of all, on the CD, we had to change the media link server URL to not be the CD server as it would normally be. So we pointed it to be the rendering host itself. And then, as I showed the configuration before, we also had a media library path. And then the only thing we did was to configure our app to use a file server. So we passed in some file server options to say, okay, use a physical file provider in this directory and serve it in this virtual directory in the web server. And that was all we had to do to be able to serve media. But this, of course, does come with some downsides, because if we look at the total picture again on the next slide, and compare with Experience Edge, we cannot scale media in our setup because we're serving it statically from the file system. So again, you could achieve the same in our case. You could, of course, put a CDN in front, and then you'd be able to do the same and kind of replicate the same logic that Sitecore have applied. But I think that is clearly one shortcoming. And of course, on the second part, we only serve the layout data, as mentioned before. We don't have the item data at all. So yeah, I think that's about the rendering host, and it was interesting to see how easy and how far we could come quite quickly. To sum a bit up, oh, you don't have the fancy background here. Oh no. But to sum it up, this is built in 24 hours, so do not try this in production at all. But I still think that there are a couple of cases where Speedo does make sense, and to cover those three examples. First of all, the scenario of a China setup. In our case, it would be possible to have, I think maybe it was mentioned on the original slide, one of the first ones comparing a hybrid headless setup with Speedo, that it was self-contained. So it is literally a .NET Core application with access to file system. And that means that you'd easily be able to spin up this application in any Chinese infrastructure as long as you have the files available. There is no dependency on outbound requests. You could easily build something that would zip up the snapshot, file transfer it into mainland China, extract it, and serve it. And I think this is actually a strength of this, because if you look at Experience Edge, it is dependent on doing outbound requests. The second one is if we look at really high volume traffic solutions with a lot of outbound traffic from an app, especially when we're talking about Azure, both in AKS and in app services. We have something called Source Network Address Translation, which is abbreviated SNAT. And people that have done high volume solutions have probably experienced what is known as SNAT exhaustion, that there simply aren't enough ports available in the app service plan that you have available to do the outbound request. So if you have a lot of visitors, you might run into the case that you're simply exhausting the outbound traffic. Then you can use higher scale app services, but still. But of course, Experience Edge, as we saw before, has edge caching, but this is between Experience Edge and an app service. So bear in mind that the app service would still be requesting the edge to get the data, unless you then implement cache on the app itself. And we didn't show this. If we have time, we can show that afterwards. But secondly, another thing is if you have high volume applications, we did performance monitor or performance load test the hybrid headless compared to Speedo. Of course, we haven't tested with Experience Edge, but we can show that it is considerably less CPU intensive by looking at the load test results. The last example is having a local container development, where you can see how easy it is when you just have the volumes mounted in Docker. Sitecore will be supporting local mirroring without actually having to publish to the edge. But for sure, with Speedo, it's completely easy to achieve this. And I think actually this concludes the session for now. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for listening. And of course, if there are any questions and we can take them, then we would like to do that. I will just find the load test results meanwhile. Should be something down here. Yeah, so the first one.
This one is with, this one is showing results with hybrid headless, so using the CD layout service requests.
And yeah, the mean and the max and the medians. And you can see if we go to the Speedo version, then it's something like factor 3 that it has improved in times here.
And there is no doubt that simply given the network latency from the app to Experience Edge, just from a complete speed of light theory, it can never be as fast as picking it directly from the disk. But that doesn't mean that it necessarily is a better option.
Exactly.
Because you have the whole distribution and global distribution. I mean, of the assets on the network in the experience edge.
And then the do not try this at home. Double sending message we have here. I think that's everything. I don't know if there are questions that we can answer.
Not seeing any questions right now.
Not seeing anything.
If anyone has any questions, feel free to drop it in the chat. Right? I think we're good.
Then I think it's thank you very much for listening, and have a continued awesome SUGCON, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, Sebastian.
Take
Thank
care.
you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Now is the time for solidarity in the face of this threat to all of humanity. I implore leaders to stand together and heed this appeal